Welcome to a stroll round Tate Britain again. And this week we're dealing with the room 1810 to 1840, which I call Regency to Victorian. And next week it's William Blake and then Turner. And I just wanted to repeat that my plan is to take a break until after Christmas, if there is a Christmas this year, and then start again in January in order to spread it out. And when we begin, I'll be starting with a talk on Constable, and then moving on to the next room. In other words, after this week, for the next 3 sessions, I'll be talking about individual artists because there's a lot to say about them, perhaps the most famous artists in the collection, British artists, and then move on to the rooms after that. So today's room is Regency to Victorian. 1810 is the year when the future George IV, then Prince George, became regent. And in 1820, he became king for 10 years, and then 7 years of William IV. And then, as you see here, Queen Victoria became queen in 1837. There were a lot of changes going on in Britain at the time. It was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It started with the building of canals and factories, and moved on at the beginning of the Victorian period to the construction of railways, the age of steam ships for more efficient transport, and the invention of photography, which was just about at the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria, and she made use of it. But before I talk about Queen Victoria and the way she used art and her interest in art, which is the focus here, rather than spending too long on the history, this painting by Franz Xavier Winterhalter, by Landseer, I'll talk about Winterhalter in a moment, by Edwin Landseer, is called Windsor Castle in Modern Times, an interesting title in modern times. The Queen is presenting herself as a normal household. Not quite normal, because what we see here is Prince Albert has returned from a day's hunting, and the game birds are spread across the floor. He is stroking his favorite dog, which is a greyhound, and the other dogs, the terriers, are the favorites of Queen Victoria. And then the other side, on the left of the painting, is the eldest daughter, who's actually holding a kingfisher. So it not typical in the sense of game spread out across the room, but a lot different from the way that monarchs used to previously presented themselves. And she is showing herself as a normal family, but with differences. And this is one of the ways that she used art, and particularly the way she used photography later to project an image of herself and her family as more normal people than monarchs had done in the past. A couple of interesting details. Prince Albert, who is taller than, he was about 5'10", and she was under 5 foot. We don't know exactly, but she could have been as 4'10". But she is shown higher than him for status reasons. She is the monarch, and the way that Landseer has done that is by having him seated, so her head is slightly higher than his. Although, if you look, if he stood up, he would, I don't know, he would be about twice her height. So to me, the proportions are slightly wrong. It took Landseer 4 years to paint this, and amidst much complaining from Queen Victoria, who wanted to see the painting sooner. In the end, she described as a very beautiful picture and altogether very cheerful and pleasing. And she hung it in her sitting room at Windsor Castle. So she was pleased with it. Landseer became a very well, in fact, probably certainly one of the leading painters in the country. And I mentioned last week that paintings could sell for as much as, I think I said £5,000. In fact, some of his later work sold for £6,000 or £7,000, like Monarch of the Glen, one of his most famous works. But coming back to Queen Victoria and art, her personal interest in art, for some reason, she's seen now as a slightly prudish person, but she wasn't. And well, I won't get into the Victorians as a whole, focusing on her. This is the sort of painting that she liked by Winterhalter, Florinda, it's called. It's a story of a legend about what happened in Spain in, I think it was about the 8th century, so in the Middle Ages. And the King of Spain, who is, can you see here? There's a figure with a crown. The King of Spain is spying on a group of young ladies, including this young lady, Florinda, who he, according to legend, I don't think it was true, but according to legend, he raped her, and this led to her father supporting the Arabs, and it led to the fall of Christian Spain to the Muslim Arabs. And so it's a well-known legend in Spain that's often portrayed partly as it's a way of showing naked women, which Victoria approved of. She bought this painting as a present, a birthday present for Prince Albert, and it was hung in front of their desks at Osborne House. And she described it as, in her journal, a most lovely picture containing a group of beautiful women. And she was very much in favor of the female nude, although
hi there.
Victorian society wasn't. Hold on. Let me mute. Sorry. Let me mute everybody again. I think somebody came in then with the sound turned on, and I remember I'm recording this and putting it up on the internet, so that's one reason I switch off all of the video and sound. Where did I get to? So she approved of this sort of painting and bought it as birthday presents for Prince Albert. Maybe I spent too long on this sort of influence on art, because at the Royal Academy, it was, apart from William Etti that we'll see later, the female nude was hardly ever shown. So let's get on to the room. And the route that I'm taking goes through the rooms we've been through previously. It's no longer the quickest way to get there. The quickest way would be to go through the 1840 room, but the room, starting with the Tudor room, the 1540 room, going round, these are the rooms that we've covered so far. And now we're coming into the room of works painted between 1810 and 1840. And let's get on to the room. We've just come through this door here. I won't spend time on the work by Edward Bailey, this bust of Wellington.
I'm due to do the sheets.
Somebody else has come in with,
I always do them at the
with the
beginning
sound on. Sorry about that. Could I just ask if anybody comes in after 10:45, could they come in with the sound switched off, please? The the Duke of Wellington is shown here as part of a series of images of busts representing the worthies of Victorian England, and the worthies included George Canning, the politician, through to John Milton and Isaac Newton. And so the idea was that these great Englishmen were those that supported the growth of the British Empire, and the fact that he's wearing this Roman toga provides another link between the British Empire and the Roman Empire, which were associated in Victorian England. The two were equated together. I've spent a bit too long. I said I wasn't going to talk about it. Edward Bailey, by the way, is the person, the sculptor, who responsible for the statue of Nelson on top of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. But let's get started with John Linnell. Kensington gravel pits. It's interesting because it's not a conventional landscape, because it shows people at work. Let me show you a conventional landscape, and it enables me to just show you a painting I mentioned earlier before we started by Moreland. Moreland, remember, is the artist we talked about last week, and over the one who got perpetually drunk, except when his wife managed to stop him drinking for a 10-year period. And this is the gravel diggers as well, but you can see it's very different. Someone asked me how Moreland could paint 4,000 paintings in his lifetime, because it takes a long time for oil to dry. That's true. And I said one of the things I think that enabled him to do that is he painted quite thinly. And I think you can see in this painting here, the paint isn't thick oil paints. It's to some extent it's painted on thinly so that it would dry more quickly, and he could sell these paintings while still wet, because he would sell them to fund his next week's drinking, and dealers were queuing up in the pub to give him money and rush off with the paintings. But a bit off the subject, because I was saying that this is a conventional painting. It's a picturesque landscape. You can't see the workings. They can't really see the gravel they're digging. It's a landscape with a sky. There's some sheep in the background, and the workers are taking a rest. They're having their lunch. Whereas in the Linnell painting, we see them working. This is very unusual. This is almost a first, I think. And we see a well-known, in London, it would have been a well-known area. Just to explain where this area is, if you take the road from Notting Hill Gate down to Kensington High Street, you're coming down, it would be on your left. In other words, it's to the east, between that road and Kensington Palace, which was there at the time. And that area was used as gravel pits from the Tudor period, and it provided gravel for the building trade in London, who were building London's West End. It came from these Kensington gravel pits. They were well known as an area close to London, but in the countryside, known for fresh air and their views north. So very sparsely populated, apart from these gravel pits. And Linnell is showing them working the pits, and he was and became a famous painter of landscapes, and he was a rival to an artist who's today much better known, John Constable. But in those days, it would be, you might even prefer a Linnell to a Constable, because there were a lot of criticisms of Constable's work at the time. More of that another week. He was also, Linnell was associated with William Blake. He was a friend of William Blake. And in fact, he was the person who introduced William Blake to Samuel Palmer, an artist I'll be talking about later. And he painted throughout his life until old age. He retired to, well, retired's the wrong word. He moved to Red Hill and continued painting. And in fact, I think he must be the artist with the longest history of professional painting, because he painted professionally and was exhibited at the Royal Academy from the age of 10 And his last works were exhibited when he was 90 years old. So he had 80 years of professional painting. And he was well-known and accepted artist throughout that period. Right. A much better known artist, Joseph Mallord William Turner, The Field of Waterloo. But again, this is a first as well. And I'll lead into why it was a first by talking through the painting and then extracting some of the points here. First of all, the light in the background, the white light in the background, it is a flare. It's not, as some people think, a holy angel visiting the scene. It's a flare that's been sent up for reasons I'll come back to. On the right is the Chateau of Oogama, where the most intense fighting, because it was a key strategic place, the intense fighting took place throughout the day. And it's shown on fire, and that fire is providing another light to the scene, reflected off the water you can see below it. And then the final source of illumination are the torches held by women who are searching the dead. One would imagine looking for their loved ones. If you look at the dead, you will see a mixture of uniforms of British and French soldiers. This is unusual. It's the painting was accompanied by a line in the catalogue, and this was quite common for artists to put in some text in the catalogue. And this line was from Byron's anti-war poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and it read, "Rider and horse, friend, foe, in one red burial blent." So the poem and the painting is saying that in death, we're all the same. This was a first, in the sense that previously pictures of battles presented heroic scenes, often pyramidal, where there'd be a flag in the center, and there'd be it would be a picture of a victory. And if it was a British artist, it would be British soldiers on horses at the point of victory, maybe holding a standard or a flag with swords flashing. Look at this picture. It's nothing like that. And it was heavily criticized at the time. It has been described as an anti-war painting. I think it's possible that's going too far. I'm not sure that Turner was making an anti-war point, although arguably he was. He was making, I would think it more as an honest portrayal of what happens after a battle, what happens in war. And in this battle, the Battle of Waterloo, there were more people killed than any other in one day than any other single battle. Estimates vary, but many say 50,000 people, 42,000 to 53,000. I can hold on. I can see that some person, there's still a video on, right? So a terrible battle where many were killed. Now, let's move on to another aspect of the painting, which comes back to the bright light in the sky. And that is, following a battle, following all major battles, people would go to the battlefield to look for valuables that they stole. And these included, for example, blood-soaked clothing, which the following day, the following week, the following month, tourists would visit the scene of the battlefield and buy memorabilia, which included blood-soaked clothes, as well as you know, jewelry and so on. And another slightly surprising thing that was taken were teeth. And I don't mean gold teeth, which were obviously taken. I just mean ordinary teeth were pulled out because they were extremely valuable. People would buy false teeth. The cheapest were made of wood. They didn't last long. They could be made of ivory. They were much more valuable, but the best teeth were made of human teeth. And for a long period, I think for 50 years afterwards, a good set of dentures made from human teeth were called Waterloo teeth. I don't think the teeth taken lasted for that long, but it became, there were so many sets of dentures produced with teeth taken from the field of battle at Waterloo that they became known as Waterloo teeth. So the reason they sent up flares was so that soldiers could go round and stop looting. So by showing that, Turner is highlighting another aspect of the battle, and that is the looting followed by the tourism, if you like, in contrast to the horror and death that was taking place. And so it makes you think that the women in the painting, are they looking for their loved ones, or are they searching for teeth, valuables to strip off the corpses? It's an open question. We don't know, but it raises that question. And this led to it being criticized. Again, like a lot of these criticisms, some critics liked the painting, other critics disliked it. There was a mixture of reaction to the painting, but there was certainly a lot of criticism of the fact that he wasn't celebrating our victory. Let's move on though. And the next artist is the other most famous artist of the period, John Constable. Controversial artist at the time. Let me skip over this large biblical story by Henry Thompson and look more closely at there's a lot to say about this Constable for various reasons, because it was a critical point in his life. But let me look at the painting first. What we see is a Flatford Mill. A Scene on a Navigable River was its original title, but it is near Flatford Mill. We see the young boys and men separating the tow horse from the barge, and the bargeman is poling the barge to get it lined up to go under Flatford Bridge. This piece of wood here is the side of a bridge that goes over the river at this point, and so this barge is being poled around to push it under the bridge, because the horse will be reconnected the other side. So it's a story of you know, the everyday story of what happens around the around Flatford Mill. It's a typical day, in other words, blue sky, scudding cumulus clouds, which raises another issue, because this was painted in 1816. And let me just 1816 was called the year without a summer. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but it's because the previous year there was an enormous, the largest volcanic explosion in recorded history. In fact, way before recorded history. I think it's the largest volcanic explosion in the last 50,000 years. including much larger than the more famous Krakatoa. It put up so much ash, it was Mount Tambora. Mount Tambora exploded and put up so much ash into the atmosphere that it hid the sun, blocked the sun and cooled the planet around the world. And it resulted in cold summers, rainy days, yellow skies, deep reds and yellow sunsets, and failure of the harvest, which is not what we see here. Which enables me to sort of switch and talk a little bit about Constable, but I'll talk a lot more about him when I cover him for a whole talk in detail. He was obviously born near here in East Bergholt, and he said in his journals, painting is but another word for feeling. The sound of water escaping from mill dams, willows, old rotten planks, slimy posts and brickwork. I love such things. In other words, he's not representing what he sees exactly. He's representing the scene he grew up with, his idyllic childhood, the feelings that the scene invokes. He did incidentally paint using techniques to represent the scene topographically accurately. He put a sheet of glass on the easel, sketched the scene he saw on the glass, then transferred the drawing on the glass to a piece of paper, and then from there he transferred it onto the canvas. But I'm getting a bit off the point. 1816 was also the year that he married Maria Bicknell, who he'd been in love with since 1809. In fact, he'd known her for even longer, but her parents, and in particular her grandfather, disapproved of the marriage because her grandfather was rector. His father was essentially a lawyer to one of the lawyers to the king. And so they considered Constable, whose father was a mill owner, to be a social inferior and didn't want the marriage to take place. And the grandfather said he would disinherit her if she married. In the end, in fact, he didn't. But what happened was that Constable's mother died the previous year and his father died this year, and he came into an inheritance, and so he had a guaranteed income from his brother who ran the mill and the farm of £200 a year, and that was borderline acceptable for her parents to agree to the marriage. Her grandfather was still not sure, and they got married very quickly within 3 weeks of getting permission at St. Martin's in the Field in London in October, and then went on honeymoon down to the West Country, down to Weymouth. And this is a picture that he painted the same year. In fact, he painted it 3 months before they got married, although it does say Mrs. John Constable. That's the title that was given later. And so at this point, 1816, a lot changed for Constable. He never really went back except for holiday breaks to East Bergholt, and he lived in various places, including Brighton, but mostly in London from then onwards. I'll tell you more about the marriage later. How are we doing for time? There's quite a lot to get through today, as there always is, I know. So let's talk about one of my favorite artists, Samuel Palmer. This was painted when he lived in Shoreham in Kent. That's not Shoreham on Sea near Brighton, it's Shoreham in Kent, which is a few miles north of Sevenoaks. He regarded this as a rural paradise, and almost literally a paradise. He was a mystic. He was a friend of William Blake, and shared his ideas about the spiritual value of landscape and the mystical presence in landscape. So he, in this period when he lived in Shoreham, and the way that he funded himself was that he got an inheritance which enabled him to live for about 7 years in this idyllic village with, in fact, a small group of other artists, which he named the Ancients. Reminds me of, I don't know why they call themselves the Ancients, but it reminds me of the Ancient of Days and William Blake. Now, as I said, John Linnell introduced William Blake to Samuel Palmer, and they became best friends. Samuel Palmer was another born artist. He exhibited at the Royal Academy when he was just 14, and he met Blake when he was 17. And he, like Blake, he had visionary experiences from childhood. And in Shoreham, he got to know the people there. They mixed and knew all the people of the village, and he regarded it as another paradise on earth, almost literally. And what he's showing here is a group of parishioners almost looking as though they're walking through paradise, through heaven, and they're coming out of a church. It's called coming from evening church. It almost looks as though it's Adam and Eve at the front of the queue. He was very influential as an artist. He was, when he came back from the end of his time with Sevenoaks, or while he was in Sevenoaks, he met John Linnell's daughter, who was only 14 at the time, and he fell in love with her, and they married when she was, I think when she was 19, and that was at the end of his period at Shoreham, and they returned to London, and his inheritance had run out. He just got married, and he had to make a living, and his style of painting changed. And he painted much more conventionally, a bit like John Linnell, a lot of sunsets and so on, and landscapes paintings is what he specialized in. They sold, but they're not like the work he did when he was in Shoreham, which is the work that is most highly regarded today. Not then. In fact, when he died, his son destroyed, burnt all of the works he could find that were still in the studio, produced at Shoreham, all of his notes, all of his sketches and so on. It said it took 2 or 3 days to burn everything that he found, because his son thought that people would laugh at the Shoreham works, and that he was most proud of the works done later, which today are largely ignored. Graham Sutherland was one of those more modern artists who was heavily influenced. His style of painting changed dramatically after he first saw Samuel Palmer's work, and Sutherland described him as essentially the English Van Gogh. Now, his work, a comparison was also made by Kenneth Clark. His painting style is not the same as Van Gogh, but his approach to landscape, this spiritual or mystical, this deep feeling that arises from landscape that he's presenting in his work. Let me show you another of his works. Oh, I was going to show you briefly also a self-portrait that he painted about the same time, slightly earlier, now in the Ashmolean. And there's a second painting by Palmer that I think maybe gives you a better idea of his typical landscape that he painted at Shoreham. It's called The Gleaning Field, and it's evening, it's sunset. The gleaners who are picking up stray pieces of corn after the field's been harvested. It's in the middle of being harvested here, and they're gleaning at the end of the day. But I think the point about this painting is that it's again presenting a visionary view of the landscape. This partly because he's chosen the time of day, a liminal time of day. That is, it's at the border between daylight and night. This evening light that we see here partly gives this painting this mystical feeling. Typical of Palmer is to put these, there's a hat, there's I think a scythe, or is it a plough? I think it's a part of a plough, and this jug here with a rock in the foreground. He often did that, but when he does it, my view is it doesn't look artificial, as it could easily do if another artist stuck those things right in the foreground at the front of the painting. It looks part of the landscape. It fits in with the landscape and gives it a foreground interest. Let's switch to a very different artist, William Etti. I mentioned his name earlier, and I said that when I was talking about Queen Victoria, and I said that he was one of the few, I think in fact for a period of about 15 to 20 years, he was the only artist who was exhibiting female nudes at the Royal Academy. And he was partly responsible for raising the status of the female nude, although I don't think it was largely his doing, because he died in 1849 and the female nude didn't become a subject that was widely exhibited at the Royal Academy until the early, maybe late 1860s. There's a couple of paintings, but the early 1870s. So the 1870s was and onwards was more of the period. But he stuck with it, even though he was heavily criticized at the time. He also painted history paintings. So he was recognized as a leading artist. He was born in York, left school when he was 12 and became an apprentice printer, completed his apprenticeship, but again, an inheritance, money from his uncle, enabled him to travel to London, where he joined the Royal Academy, studied under Thomas Lawrence, and started off by copying, working in the style of Thomas Lawrence, and inspired by Titian and Rubens. And from the money he earned from those works, traveled around Europe, studying the old masters, and particularly taken by the works he found in Venice. He became known, incidentally, as in Venice for the speed of his painting, and people used to come and watch him paint because he was so fast. And he was also known for the accuracy of his flesh tones. And similarly, critics in England recognize his skill at coloration and flesh tones. But they had little time, most critics had little time for the works themselves, which they largely described as indecent. He became commercially successful through his history paintings, but his nudes were, let me give you some quotes, not fit for decent company. Etti should turn from his wicked ways. But on the other hand, his history paintings, one critic described him as the greatest of all of our history painters, rivaling Rubens and the great Venetians on their own ground. He persisted, despite all this criticism, and he persisted, and he was an extremely shy man. So he rarely socialized. He never got married. He rarely went out. He lived until his death with his niece, Betsy, or Elizabeth Etti, who looked after him. Towards the end of his life, the quality of his work deteriorated, and eventually, near the end of his life, he retired back to York. Immediately after his death, all of his paintings became highly collectible and sold for large sums, including his nudes. Taste was starting to change at that time in the 1850s, but it still, as I said, wasn't a common subject to see at the Royal Academy exhibition until the late 1860s or 1870s. So a little bit of history of the female nude. Let me quickly talk about this John Gibson, Hylas surprised by the Naiades. The story, it's a mythological story about how Hylas, who was the boy we see here, the companion of Hercules, went off to collect some water, and he was lured into the depths of the water by these water nymphs and never seen again, even though Hercules searched endlessly for him. So that's what's being presented here. John Gibson was a well-known sculptor of the period, heavily influenced by the Greeks and Romans, and works by Greek and Roman sculptors were being dug up out of the ash at Pompeii and Herculaneum. And what they found is when they first uncovered some of these statues, they saw color, and this was it quickly faded, but it was investigated, and academics became convinced that the Romans and Greeks colored their statues. They weren't white like this, and we now know that's true. They were painted in bright colors and flesh tones and so on. It was Gibson was convinced by this, and one of the statues that he's best known for is this one, the Tinted Venus. He started to tint his own statues. This particular statue is at the Walker Art Gallery. It's actually, you can see round here, it's surrounded by like a temple, because when it was first exhibited, it was exhibited alongside an imitation small Greek temple. Today it's inside the temple and surrounded by glass. But the point is that he was experimenting with a technique that he believed was used by the Greeks and Romans, and so he was seeing how this altered the work. Again, this came under a lot of criticism. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, I'll give you a quote, felt that she had seldom seen so indecent a statue. And some critics, like the Sculptures Journal, described it as one of the most beautiful and elaborate figures undertaken in modern times. And some heavily criticized it. It divided opinion. But let me, and I was talking then about the Tinted Venus. This one wasn't tinted. It was an earlier work. So moving around the room, how's time going? 1, 2, 3. I'll skip over some of these works, but I've got some to, let me quickly talk about Charles Eastlake, because he later became president of the Royal Academy, and so an important artist, gallery director, as well as painter, gallery director, collector and writer. He started as a painter. By the end of his life, he became the first director, in fact, of the National Gallery. And he's very early on in his career, I think he was, let me calculate, 23. He sold a painting for 1,000 guineas. And that funded him on a tour around Europe. And he stayed for many years in Rome, where he met other artists, including Canova and the German Nazarenes and students of the French Academy, where he with them learned to sketch outdoors from nature. And here, from the Esquiline Hill, he has produced a painting from a sketch he produced of the Coliseum. Incidentally, the Coliseum, I've got here a 3D reconstruction of what it originally looked like. And it was originally called the Flavian Amphitheater. A little bit of history here. The Flavian emperors were Vespasian, his son Titus, and Domitian. And they need to go a bit further back. Originally, this area, which was down in the valley, was a marsh, but then it was drained by a canal. And as it was drained, people could build houses there. And it was an area quite near the Forum, the centre, but it became a slum. So it became very heavily populated until in 64 AD, there was the Great Fire of Rome. You remember the one where Nero is meant to have fiddled while Rome burnt, although he probably didn't. But what he did do is, after the fire, all these slums were destroyed, and he, Nero, took all the land and built an enormous palace. Incidentally, if you do go to Rome, you must book a tour to see the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, which is under this hill. But enough on that. I don't want to get sidetracked into that. He built an enormous palace with a lake. When he died or committed suicide, we don't know which. Oh, and I should say that when he, at the end of this lake, so here there was a lake. At the end of the lake, he built a statue of himself, a gigantic bronze statue of himself. When he died, the lake was filled in. A lot of the palace was covered over and pulled down. And the Colosseum was built for the people. It was free entry. And it was built, as I said, by Vespasian. And it was built using the money from the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This amphitheater was built. As you can see, originally it had awnings, they're canvas awnings at the top to shield people from the sun, and statues at every arch. The statue, you might be wondering what happened to the statue of Nero. They changed the head and turned it into a statue of Apollo, the god, the Greek god. And later it was changed again, and it became, the heads kept getting changed to the latest emperor. So it became, for a long while, the statue of the latest emperor. And that's why, because the statue was a colossus, that's why it was called the Coliseum, after the statue, which was lost, pulled down, melted down, destroyed towards the end of the Middle Ages. We don't know exactly when. So a bit too long on that, but that's why it's called the Coliseum. Its real name, if you like, is the Flavian Amphitheater, because it's an amphitheater. It's not a statue, it's not a colossus, but we call it the Coliseum now. Eastlake, as I said, went to Rome, where he sketched this. He stayed for a number of years. He was, incidentally, he was known as the salamander. It's like Mad Dogs and Englishmen, because he would stay working and sketching in the midday sun while everybody else took a siesta. So the Italians called him the salamander. But eventually he came back to London, where he was a well-known artist, sold well, and was later voted in as president of the Royal Academy and knighted the same year. In fact, it was 1850. But enough on Eastlake. I just thought I'd needed to introduce him. Have I got time for Dice? How are we doing? I might come back to William Dice, but let me talk about Bonington. Richard Parkes Bonington. Maybe not as well known as he should be. I've said that a lot about a lot of these artists. And I think one of the reasons is that he died young. He died when he was 26. And like another famous artist, Thomas Guertin. And both those artists were friends of Turner. And Parkes Bonington, although he was born, in fact, he was born in Nottingham, his family went to France when he was 14 and to live in Calais, where his father opened a lace factory. And Bonington was being taught watercolor painting. And so he's often seen as a French artist, and a lot of, in France, he's often considered to be a French artist. And he was extremely influential on French art. In fact, if you look at this painting, particularly the sky, you'll understand why he's often described as the father of Impressionism. And he's the earliest artist to be given that title. I think it's stretching things a bit too far, but he was certainly influential on Eugène Delacroix, who was a friend of his, and Théophile Gautier, who followed a lot of his techniques, were influenced by him and spoke very highly of him. I have got some quotes. Let me give the Gautier quote. I think that's the most succinct, describing Bonington as the most natural colorist of the modern school, and whose importance for French landscape painting paralleled that of Shakespeare for modern literature. So he was extremely influential in France and also in England. And he died when he was just 26. He worked in England. He lived from the age of 14. He lived in Calais. He shared a studio with Delacroix. He studied in Paris under Antoine Gros, and he was awarded a gold medal in Paris in 1824, an important year where they showed a number of British artists, including John Constable, who also won a gold medal that year, as we'll hear about more later. And this put him at the Bonington at the forefront of the romantic landscape painters of the period. He then, when he was 23, he came to London. He was influenced by Turner and Constable. He exhibited at the British Institution, he exhibited at the Royal Academy, and then in 1827, and died the following year. Very briefly, Thomas Webster. Remember last week and this morning, I mentioned David Wilkie, and the other Jean painter was William Mulready, but the third is this painter, Thomas Webster, who was one of the leading painters of these humorous genre scenes. So this is late at school, and what you can see here is a boy and probably his sister hiding behind him and peeking out, looking through the door because they're late for school and they're going to get told off, probably a thrashing. Inside the school, one of the boys on the right there has seen him at the door and is peeking out. And the schoolmistress is getting one of the boys, I think, to read. The lessons have already started, so he's going to be in big trouble. Described at the time as a charming little composition, characteristic in every object and painted with a true feeling of the art. Today, I'm not sure we look at them with sort of well, maybe as charming and amusing. But they were very popular, particularly in engraving. So one of the reasons, or one of the ways that artists made money from this sort of painting is that they were turned into prints which sold widely. Everybody had this sort of type of painting on their wall. Whereas this is a sort of a different type of painting by James Pollard, not a well-known artist. The reason I'm showing it is because it shows a bit of Victorian life. This is the stagecoach that went from Holborn to Birmingham, and this shows it passing Whittington College in Highgate. It's a toll road. You can see here there's a toll gate. This is the toll keeper and the toll house. The reason it was a toll gate, it's called, what's the name of the road? Archway. And the archway is still there. It was a road that was built to avoid Highgate Hill. And so you paid to avoid the hill, and it was faster for the coach. And in fact, it left this coach, the Tally-Ho, left Holborn at 7:45 in the morning and arrived in Birmingham 11 hours later. So, I mean, sometimes with motorway holdups, it takes that long today. So extremely quick, and I calculated door to door using Google Maps. It's 122 miles, and that means an average speed of 11 miles an hour, including stopping to change horses and to grab something to eat and drink, an average of 11 miles an hour. So as you can see here, the coach rushing, the horses galloping, that must have been typical to average that sort of speed. In the background, I said it was Whittington College. Just a little point on that. It is a college founded, not this building, but the college was founded there as an almshouse by Dick Whittington, or Sir Richard Whittington, 4 times Lord Mayor of London. And when he died, which was a long time ago, let me check, 1423, he left £7,000, a lot of money in those days, for charitable purposes, including the building of an almshouse, which was later replaced by this building, which was named Whittington College, which later, when the archway was widened, the college was pulled down. This building was pulled down, and it was moved to, I think, somewhere in Kent. I think it was, well, it doesn't matter. I think I've got a note, Fellbridge in, sorry, not Kent, Sussex. So Whittington College is still in existence, but it's in Fellbridge. Outside, well, I've got another link there. Outside, you can see a statue of Whittington, Dick Whittington. But the original statue, this one, was lost. But another one, this one, was made. We don't know who the sculptor was, but it's now in Whittington College in Fellbridge. And this, you won't believe it, but the people of Islington that are in the same area have raised a campaign for the return of this statue to Archway Road, where it was originally situated. I think it's probably best left for the elderly people in the care home at in Fellbridge to enjoy, and it's protected from the weather. It's in a little house of its own inside the just outside the building. But anyway, I didn't intend to spend long on that, but I wanted to spend some time on this interesting painting by Benjamin Haydon, an artist I'll tell you a bit more about. But first, I'll tell you a bit about the picture. What we see, well, the title is Punch on May Day. So it's called Punch for obvious reasons, because there's a Punch and Judy show here. And less obviously, it's the 1st of May. May Day was celebrated in Victorian times. Well, it's still, I suppose, celebrated, but in a different way. In Victorian times, there were these dancers, was one way it was celebrated. It's sort of associated with Morris dancing, although Morris dancers look a lot different today. I've got a little picture, a pity about the quality of the picture, but this is by Boz, and it's from a little set of sketches that he published called The 1st of May. Oh, sorry, the book's called What Charles Dickens Saw, and this picture's called The 1st of May. And you can see more clearly here, there's like a tree, but inside it, there's a man. So let's look back to this picture here, this tree-like object. If you look very closely here, there's a person's eye. There's a man inside. In front, going back to the Boz sketch, there's a woman holding a ladle, dancing with a man. In this picture, you can't see the man, but there's the woman in a red dress with a ladle. And again, over in this picture, there's a boy blacked up. And in this picture, there's a boy blacked up, holding what looks like a fan. And we don't know why there was, the boy was blacked up. So a lot of people think he represents chimney sweeps. I don't know what the woman represents, maybe cooks. And the man with the tree represents the ancient sort of medieval Jack of the Green, or the Green Man. Coming back to the boy, it's also, there's a theory that he represents miners. So Morris dancers in mine towns, he might have blacked up to represent the miners. Some people think, maybe this is less likely, that, remember, I think on a previous occasion, I've talked about how in many English ports, English people, men, women and children, were taken as slaves by raiding pirates from North Africa. And some of those pirates would stay in England. So some people think that it represents those, either the fear of those North African pirates raiding and taking people as slaves, or I think it's probably more likely, as it's nearly always a boy, that it represents chimney sweeps. Over here in the center of the painting, there's a sailor smoking a pipe, and he, if you look, is looking at this woman who's looking down demurely. And the reason she's doing that is to distract him from the boy that's partly hidden by her cape, who's just about to steal the wallet from this man who's dressed in the clothes a farmer would wear. So he's, if you like, a naive country farmer come up to London for the day, who's entranced by the Punch and Judy. Hold on, I think somebody is got the sound switched on again. Right. This man, therefore, is just being robbed. This boy, the chimney sweep, is loving it, loving the Punch and Judy show. This girl is selling fruit, and you can see how the poor lived here, barefooted, sitting by a table all day, where she's got this meager supply of fruit for people to buy. That's how she makes a living. In the background, there is a coach containing a couple who are going off to their wedding, or have just come from a wedding, not sure which. The bride is looking down demurely, but the groom is looking out towards the Punch and Judy show, and notably Punch is hitting his wife with a stick, part of the Punch and Judy show for those that have ever seen it, or it used to be. And so this is suggesting maybe it's not going to be a happy marriage. And to add to that train of thought, there is a hearse that has just almost collided with the back of the wedding coach. And here we see the paid mourners, the undertakers, and the coffin on the back of the hearse. So a lot of detail in the painting. Why did Haydn paint it? Because it wasn't, let me talk about Haydn briefly. He was someone who spent his life promoting history painting, because whereas in France, the town halls would typically be full of history paintings, which kept painters in business. Large history paintings sold for a lot of money in France. In England, there was no market for them. Town hall, until later, there's a few town halls bought paintings, but by and large, they had a few portraits of previous mayors, but they didn't buy large history paintings. So he spent his life promoting history painting. Now, the previous year to this, Haydn had unusually painted a painting that was exhibited at the Royal Academy and bought by the king for 500 guineas. And it was a painting like, there was a Jean painting like this, unlike his normal history painting, which he couldn't sell. He was, by the way, he was a well-known artist. Everyone respected him, but he lived hand to mouth because he insisted on painting things that no one would buy. He painted this because the king had bought his painting the previous year, and he thought he could raise some money because he was in debt by painting this that would be bought by the king. But the keeper of the king's pictures, we think, advised the king not to buy this painting. So it wasn't bought, it wasn't sold. Haydn didn't pay off his debts. In the end, his debts amounted to £3,000, and rather than go to debtor's prison, he decided to commit suicide. He bought a gun, he wrote a will, he shot himself but failed to kill himself, and killed himself by slitting his throat. His will includes the sentence from Lear, Shakespeare's Lear, "Stretch me no longer on this rough world." So a sad life, and maybe a comment on the type of art that was favoured in Victorian England. It wasn't noble history paintings, it was portraits, increasingly landscapes, and to a lesser extent, but increasingly during the Victorian period, those sort of humorous genre paintings, a bit like this, but the king didn't buy this. Let me just let me talk about this Constable. Although I will be spending a week on Constable, that would be after Christmas. This is a sketch for Hadley Castle, and it enables me to just briefly cover the final point of Constable's life, carrying on from the painting of Flatford Mill that we saw earlier. Now, we have actually the original sketch, which he did some years before this. It's just this simple sketch from his sketchbook, which is now in the V&A. And I should have said actually that Flatford Mill was the first of his larger paintings, which are called 6-footers. Now, actually, Flatford Mill is not 6 foot, but he increased the size later to 6 foot. And one of the reasons was to get noticed when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. It was big, so people couldn't fail to see it. And to get the composition right, what he did was, unusually, uniquely, he would paint these 6 foot sketches of the painting and then not paint over them, but to keep them and work on the final canvas with this sketch alongside it. And I've got the final canvas here. Let me show you. This is the final canvas, which is in America. It's at the Yale Center for British Art. And it's interesting to compare the two. That's the sketch. And that's the final painting. So the sketch, as I said, he used to get the composition right. This was painted in 1828. Let's go back 4 years. As I said, in 1824, he won the gold medal in France. And there was a French dealer, John Arrowsmith, who found that his work was suddenly in great demand in France. And he got some commissions. One commission was to paint a landscape where he was, his choice of landscape, £400, which, remember, Constable was largely living on an allowance, or not an allowance, but a salary from the farm run by his brother of £200 a year. And Arrowsmith, as soon as he got the commission, sent the money directly to Constable. But Constable was a strange fellow. Let me give you a quote. His best friend, John Fisher, wrote and told Constable this: "We are all given to torment ourselves with imaginary evils, but no man ever had this disease in such alarming paroxysms as yourself. You imagine difficulties where none exist, displeasure where none is felt, contempt where none is shown, and neglect where none is meant." And that's a good summary of Constable. Was a meticulous painter. He was very well studied in the theory of painting, but in terms of his personality, what happened is that he failed to paint this painting for which he was sent £400. So Arrowsmith came from France to visit him in London. And then for some reason, and poor old Arrowsmith didn't speak English very well, and he said something that upset Constable, and he sent him away. And Arrowsmith apologized, but Constable refused to accept the apology, and Arrowsmith left. So he got no more works in France. He sold more works in France in 1 year than he sold in the whole time, his whole life in England. 20 paintings in England and about 20 in France in 1 year. But he spoilt the relationship with his dealer. He never visited France. He didn't want to go to foreign countries. He was that sort of person as well. But coming back to this year, 1828, Maria, his wife, fell ill. They had 7 children by then, and she died of tuberculosis, age 41. And Constable was devastated. He wrote, "Hourly do I feel the loss of my departed angel. God only knows how my children will be brought up." He dressed in black for the rest of his life. And a lot of people have interpreted this painting in the light of that depression, which it's the broken tower representing his broken life, is what people have read into it. I'm not sure that I do, but there's been a lot of speculation about that. So let's move on. That's the final painting in America. To, oh dear, I'll have to choose one. Do we want let's finish with an amusing one. What we have here is not a very well-known artist, Edward Burney, but another Jean painting telling an amusing story called Amateurs of Tie Wig Music, Musicians of the Old School. And what I thought you'd find interesting about this is that the old school is not Beethoven and Mozart. The old school is Handel and Purcell. And in fact, they are burning the works of Beethoven and Mozart because they are regarded as unacceptable modern new music. I'll let that sink in. Now, it's difficult to see this, so very quickly, I know I've run out of time, but I found an engraving with a lot more detail. So I can show you Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn are being burnt in the grate. Meanwhile, there's a broken string here on the violin. The bow has just knocked these tea and sugar into the grate, and the boy is looking horrified. The dog is howling. The Man has just left the room with his ears covered. This man here who's yawning is just, while yawning, he's lifted his hands and knocked all the candles off the candelabra, and the bow is entering his mouth. Let me move on from this to the other corner of the painting. I couldn't get all the detail in one go. And over here we see the person pushing this lever up and down to work the organ has fallen asleep. The woman and the organ is horrified. The music they're playing is predates Handel. It's by Corelli, and this, just to show you, the bow is the wrong side of the strings here. The dog is howling. The cat is shrieking because it's just been sat on down here. The woman is falling asleep. It's all going on in this painting. I thought I'd end with a laugh. And the children, I'll finish with the children, are playing a file, a rasp on this metal scraper, and a saw on these bellows. So let me finish with that. And next week, we won't be going to the next room, the 1840 room. We'll be turning down there and crossing to the other side to a room upstairs, which contains works by William Blake,